I was standing at the kitchen counter making a cup of tea when my son-in-law's phone lit up on the table beside me. He'd left it there when he went to change our grandson's diaper. Little Owen was 4 months old at the time, still at that stage where everything required 2 hands and your full attention. And Fletcher had asked me to watch the phone in case his office called about something urgent. I wasn't trying to read anything. I wasn't snooping. The screen just lit up and the preview was right there, and I read it the way you read a billboard when you're stopped at a red light. You don't decide to look, you just do. The message was from a contact saved as Danny W. It said, "Miss you already. When can I see you again? Last night was everything." I set my mug down. Fletcher was still in the back bedroom. I could hear him talking to Owen in that soft, silly voice you use with babies, making little sounds, narrating the diaper change like a sports commentator. My daughter Vivienne was at her office downtown. She was a project manager at a mid-size engineering firm in Ottawa, back at work 3 weeks after her maternity leave ended because they'd needed her for a contract deadline. And she'd said yes because she always said yes, because that's who Vivienne was. I picked up the mug again, then put it down again. Last night was everything. I'm 63 years old. I've been around long enough to know that a sentence like that doesn't come from a work colleague. It doesn't come from a cousin or an old university friend catching up over drinks. I've also been around long enough to know what it looks like when a man is hiding something. My own father hid things. My first business partner hid things. I know the shape of it. I walked to the window and looked out at the backyard. It was early November in Ottawa, and the maple in the corner had already dropped most of its leaves. The grass was that tired gray-green it gets before the first real frost. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes, just breathing. Then I walked back to the table, picked up Fletcher's phone, and took a screenshot of the message preview with my own phone. I don't know exactly why I did it in that moment. Maybe I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it yet. Maybe I just knew that evidence has a way of disappearing. Whatever the reason, I took the screenshot, slid my phone back into my shirt pocket, and was standing at the counter with my tea when Fletcher came back into the kitchen carrying Owen against his shoulder. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Fine," I said. "Your phone lit up. I think it might have been a work call." He glanced at the phone and I watched his face. Just for a second, maybe less than a second, something moved across it, a tightening around the eyes. He picked up the phone without looking at me, turned slightly toward the window, and swiped at the screen. "Yes," he said. "Work stuff. Nothing urgent." Owen made a small sound against his shoulder, and Fletcher patted his back. "You want more tea?" he asked. "I'm all right," I said. "I need to back up a little, because none of this will make full sense unless you understand who Fletcher is, or rather, who I thought he was. My daughter Vivienne met Fletcher Arnault when she was 28. She'd been working in Montreal at the time, and he was finishing a law degree at McGill. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming. Not flashy, not performative, but quietly attentive. He remembered details. He asked follow-up questions. The first time I met him was at a dinner Vivienne organized at a restaurant in the Plateau, and he spent 20 minutes asking me about my years running a small electrical contracting company in Kingston, and he actually listened to the answers. He wasn't waiting for his turn to talk. My wife Patricia liked him immediately. She died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, very fast, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. And one of the last coherent conversations we had was about how glad she was that Vivienne had found someone solid. That's the word she used. Solid. They got married in 2019. Small wedding outside of Perth, in a heritage barn that Vivienne had found after 6 months of searching. It rained in the afternoon but cleared up by the time they cut the cake. I danced with my daughter to a Norah Jones song, and cried in the way that men my age cry, which is quietly and with a lot of looking at the ceiling. Fletcher had joined a mid-size firm in Ottawa by then. Family law, of all things. And they'd bought a house in Barhaven, a semi-detached on a street with good neighbors and a backyard that got afternoon sun. They were happy. Or they seemed happy. I visited once a month, stayed in their guest room, babysat when needed. I was the widower father-in-law who tried not to overstay his welcome, tried not to offer opinions that weren't asked for, tried to be present without being a burden. And then Owen arrived in July, and everything got louder and more exhausting and more beautiful all at once. And I drove up from Kingston more often because Vivienne needed the help and I needed the company. And Fletcher seemed genuinely besotted with the baby, in the way that new fathers sometimes are. And I genuinely thought, that everything was exactly what it looked like. Last night was everything. I drove back to Kingston that evening without saying anything to either of them. I sat with the screenshot on my phone for 3 days. I looked at it probably 40 times. I turned it over in my mind the way you turn over a stone you've found in your garden, not sure whether what's underneath is something harmless or something you're going to have to deal with. There were things I told myself during those 3 days. I told myself it could be nothing, that Danny W. could be a colleague with poor professional boundaries, that the message could be innocent in some context I wasn't seeing, that I was a 63-year-old man who had read a phone screen for 2 seconds and was maybe projecting something. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself that if I was wrong, I could destroy my relationship with Fletcher and create a wound in my family that might never fully close. I told myself that Vivian was an adult and could handle her own marriage. But then I thought about Owen, 4 months old, completely unaware. And I thought about Vivian at 3 in the morning, nursing him, exhausted, trusting the man asleep in the next room. And I thought about Patricia saying the word solid. And I thought about that dinner at the restaurant in the plateau. And I thought about the way Fletcher's face had moved. Just barely. Just for a fraction of a second, when he picked up his phone. On the 4th day, I called my old friend Lawrence, who I've known since we were both young fathers with toddlers and mortgages and more ambition than sense. Lawrence is not a man who gives advice lightly. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which took a while, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Howard, you already know what you're going to do. You're just looking for someone to tell you it's okay." He was right. I hired a private investigator. I want to be clear about what that decision felt like because it's easy to make it sound decisive and purposeful in the retelling. It wasn't. I spent an afternoon on my laptop researching licensed private investigators in Ottawa, and I felt like an absolute fool the entire time. I'm a retired electrician from Kingston, Ontario. I'm not the kind of person who hires investigators. I coach minor hockey on Wednesday evenings and I have a vegetable garden in the summer, and I watch the Senators even though they break my heart every spring. This was not part of my life's plan. But I found someone. A woman named Sandra who ran a small licensed agency out of a Canada office, who had been a former Ottawa police detective and who, when I explained the situation over the phone, did not make me feel foolish at all. She asked clear, precise questions. She told me what she could and couldn't do, what was legal and what wasn't, what I might find out and what I might not. She charged me $1,800 for 2 weeks of intermittent observation. I paid it without blinking, which surprised me. But then, some things are worth knowing, no matter what they cost. She came back to me in 10 days. Fletcher Arnault was having an affair with a paralegal from his firm named Danielle Wishart. They had been together, by Sandra's estimate, for approximately 8 months. They met at a wine bar near Elgin Street on average twice a week. On 2 occasions during the observation period, they had gone to Danielle Wishart's apartment on Marlborough Avenue and stayed for several hours. 8 months. Owen was 4 months old. That means Fletcher Arnault had been sleeping with Danielle Wishart while his wife was pregnant. He had been doing it through the 3rd trimester. He had been doing it while Vivian was preparing the nursery, going to prenatal appointments, signing them both up for a birth preparation class at the General. He had been doing it the night before Owen was born. I don't know that for certain, but the math suggests it's possible, and my mind went there and didn't easily come back. I sat in my kitchen in Kingston with Sandra's report on my laptop screen and I didn't move for a long time. The thing about a moment like that is that it's not just one emotion. People talk about betrayal like it's a single feeling, but it isn't. It's a layered thing. There was grief, genuine grief, for the version of Fletcher I had believed in. There was anger, which was hot and immediate and very physical, a tightening in my chest and my hands. There was something that might have been guilt, because I had liked him, I had trusted him, I had welcomed him into the family with something close to gratitude. And underneath all of it, something quieter and heavier, the thought of Vivian. My daughter who was 3 weeks back at work after maternity leave. My daughter who was getting up in the night with Owen while Fletcher slept. My daughter who had said I do in a heritage barn outside of Perth, while it rained on the tent and then cleared up for the cake. My daughter who didn't know. I thought carefully about what to do next. I want to make that clear too. I didn't act out of anger, or not only out of anger. I spent a week planning. The first question was whether to tell Vivian directly. I almost did. I picked up the phone 3 times. But each time I stopped, because I kept thinking about how she would receive it. From me, her father, without any documentation, in a phone call. And I thought about how that could go wrong. How she might not believe me. How she might tell Fletcher, who would have time to construct a defense. How she might, and this was the hardest thought, decide she needed to protect her marriage and pull away from me instead. I needed her to see the evidence herself. I needed it to be undeniable. The second question was Danielle Wishart. I thought about her too. She was not, as far as I could tell from Sandra's report, some naive young woman who didn't know Fletcher was married. She was 34 years old, worked in his firm, and had been to family gatherings at the office where Vivian had been present. She knew. She had made her choices with full knowledge. but it was the third person I kept coming back to. Fletcher's mother, Irene Arnault. I had met Irene perhaps a dozen times over the years. She was a retired school principal from Sudbury, a small, sharp woman in her late 60s who had driven 6 hours to be at the hospital the day Owen was born. She had sat in that waiting room with me for 4 hours, and we'd drunk terrible coffee from the vending machine and talked about our grandchild. And she had cried when Fletcher came out to tell us that Vivienne and Owen were both healthy and well. Irene Arnault would want to know. I also thought about this. Fletcher's firm handled family law. He knew exactly how divorces worked. He knew what a man could do to protect assets if given enough warning. If I called Vivienne first and she confronted him, he would have time. Time to move money. Time to consult with colleagues. Time to get ahead of things in ways that would hurt Vivienne financially for years. I needed everything to happen at once, or as close to at once as I could manage. On a Wednesday afternoon in late November, I sent 3 things simultaneously. To Vivienne, I sent a message that said, "I need to talk to you about something important. Please don't say anything to Fletcher before we speak. Call me when you're alone." And attached to that message was Sandra's full report, with the photographs, the dates, the addresses, the 8 months of documented evidence. To Irene Arnault, I sent a shorter message. I said that I was sorry to have to contact her this way, that what I was sending her would be painful, and that I hoped she would understand I had no choice. Then I forwarded Sandra's report, and the third thing I sent, and I'll be honest about this because I've thought about it many times since, was an email to the Law Society of Ontario. I want to be clear about why I did that last part. It wasn't pure revenge, or maybe it was partly revenge. I'm 63, not a saint. But I also knew something that mattered. Danielle Wishart was a paralegal at Fletcher's firm. Fletcher was a family lawyer. There are rules about workplace relationships and conflicts of interest in that profession, and I had read enough about those rules in the 2 weeks since Sandra came back to me to know that what had happened inside that firm might be something the Law Society would want to know about. I wasn't making the decision for them. I was giving them the information. What they did with it was their business. Then I sat down in my kitchen in Kingston and I waited. Vivienne called me 47 minutes later. She didn't say hello. She said my name, just Dad, and in that one syllable I heard everything I needed to know. She had looked at the report. "How long have you known?" she asked. 3 weeks, I said. "I'm sorry it took me this long. I needed to be sure." She was quiet for a moment and then she said very quietly, "He was Dad. Owen wasn't even born yet." "I know," I said. "He was at the hospital. He was there. He cut the cord." Her voice didn't break, it went very still, which was in some ways worse. "And he was—" "I know," I said again. "She asked me to come to Ottawa. I was already packed. I had been packed for 2 days. I drove up that evening. By the time I arrived, Vivienne had called her friend Stephanie, who was a family lawyer in a different firm, and had agreed to start consulting that night. She had also called her HR department to notify them. She needed a leave extension for family reasons. She was efficient and methodical even in the worst moments of her life. She got that from her mother. And I felt an ache of pride and grief tangled together watching her move through the kitchen making notes on her phone. Fletcher was at work. He didn't know yet. I stayed with Owen while Vivienne and Stephanie talked in the living room. I held him against my chest and walked slow circles in the kitchen the way you do with babies when they're fussy, and I thought about everything that was going to change for this little boy who had no idea any of it existed. He wasn't going to remember any of this. That was a mercy. But it was still going to shape his life in ways none of us could fully see yet. Fletcher arrived home at 6:30. I heard his key in the lock. I heard him put down his bag. I heard Vivienne say his name from the living room in a voice that had no warmth in it at all. And then I heard the conversation begin, and I stayed in the kitchen with Owen and I did not go in. I'm not going to give you the details of what was said. Some things are private, even in a story like this. What I will tell you is that it lasted about 90 minutes. And that at some point I heard Fletcher's voice go from confident to defensive to something lower and harder to listen to, and that Vivienne never raised hers above a level I might have called controlled. At some point Fletcher came into the kitchen. He looked at me for a long moment. He started to say something. I genuinely don't know what, and then stopped. He looked at Owen in my arms. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him and waited. He went back into the living room. He left the house at about 8 o'clock with a bag he'd packed in 20 minutes. Vivienne had told him the locks would be changed in the morning, and she had already sent an email to his firm's managing partner, something she'd decided on her own that I hadn't suggested, notifying them that her husband was involved in a personal relationship with a firm employee that she believed they should be aware of. Her friend Stephanie told her that was a bold move. Vivienne said she was tired of being careful on behalf of people who hadn't been careful with her. I stayed in Ottawa for 2 weeks. Irene Arnaud drove down from Sudbury 4 days after I sent her the report. She knocked on the front door on a Saturday morning, and Vivian answered it, and the two of them stood in the doorway for a moment, and then Irene said, "I'm so sorry, Vivian. I am so deeply sorry." And Vivian, who had been holding herself together with both hands for 4 days, let her arms drop, and they held each other on the front step in the November cold. And I watched from the hallway and thought about Patricia, and about all the things that survive betrayal when they're built on something solid. Irene Arnaud did not speak to her son for 11 weeks. I know this because Vivian told me. I have no other information about Fletcher's life from that point on, and I prefer to keep it that way. The Law Society matter I won't discuss in detail, not because nothing happened, but because it's Vivian's business and Fletcher's business, and not mine to characterize publicly. What else I'll say is that the process moved slowly, the way those processes do, and that Vivian's lawyer watched it carefully. What I can tell you about are the smaller things, the things that mattered more than any of it. I can tell you that on Owen's first Christmas, which was 4 weeks after everything came apart, we drove to Vivian's sister in Guelph and had dinner with 8 people in a too-small dining room. And Owen was passed from lap to lap to lap, until he fell asleep in his grandfather's arms, mine, while the table was still loud with talking. I sat there with this tiny warm weight against my chest, breathing the way babies breathe, completely trusting, completely unaware, and I thought, this is what I did it for. Not the report, not the Law Society, not the locks changed in the morning. This. I can tell you that Vivian is the kind of person who, when things go wrong, gets up and keeps moving. She's always been that way. She found a therapist she liked. She renegotiated her leave. She talked to a financial advisor about the house. She didn't disappear into it. She dealt with it and kept going, and watching her do that was one of the more humbling things I have ever witnessed. I can tell you that the DNA test, because yes, we did one, and I know that sounds like a strange thing to have to say, but given the timeline and given everything, Vivian's lawyer recommended it, and Vivian agreed it was the right thing to do for Owen's future, legally and otherwise. The DNA test came back exactly as we needed it to. Owen is Fletcher's son. He is my daughter's son. He is my grandson. That was already true, but having it confirmed in writing closed a door that had been standing open in a cold wind, and we were all grateful to shut it. It's been 8 months since that November. Vivienne is doing well. That's not a platitude, I mean it specifically and carefully. She is doing well. She has hard days. She has days when she's running on 4 hours of sleep and Owen is teething and her ex-husband's lawyer sends something that has to be responded to. And she calls me and she sounds worn down in a way that I recognize from my own worst year after Patricia died. But she is moving through it. She has a small circle of friends who have shown up for her in the way that good people do in a crisis. And she has her work, which she's good at, and which gives her structure. And she has Owen, who is now almost a year old, and who has begun pulling himself upright on the furniture, and who looks, with increasing clarity, exactly like Vivian did at the same age. I drive up from Kingston every 2 weeks. Sometimes more. I cook dinner. I take Owen for walks in his stroller around the neighborhood while Vivian does calls from home. Sometimes I sit in the backyard after Owen goes down, and Vivian and I just talk about Patricia, about nothing. About the maple in the corner that's dropping its leaves again. And there are evenings when I think that this, too, is what family is. Not the version in the photos from the barn outside of Perth, though that was real too. This version. The one you build after the thing you trusted turns out not to hold. I think about the moment in the kitchen when I first saw that message. And I think about all the ways I could have looked away. I could have told myself it wasn't my business. I could have chosen comfort over clarity. I was 63 years old, a widower. A retired electrician, not a man built for any of this. But I had a daughter who didn't know what was being done to her in her own home. And I had a grandson asleep in the next room. And I had a screenshot on my phone. Some things you just can't unknow.